Welcome back to the Foolery Show, where two cynics desperately try to find the positive side. Let's talk about why capitalism is good for people. And I think that it's so easy to see the problems with capitalism, when in reality, I think it's a great system for economies, a great thing just for the people themselves. Because if you just look at pure capitalism compared to other things, it's all about collecting money. And you
Yes.
assume that everyone's greedy, no one can be trusted.
Yes.
And so you all work towards getting as much money as possible. So everyone's awful. Everyone tries to be as awful as possible. But in a weird way, if everyone's awful, no one's awful, and it kind of balances out this thing where people are constantly being awful, but in a weird way, the society is good.
Yeah, I would say it's more like your self-interest can actually work towards the betterment of society as a whole. Because for example, it's in your self-interest to provide a good product for customers, right? So you can make more money. So then that motivates you to make a product or a business that's better for everyone. So in that sense, capitalism, in theory, it motivates businesses and people to do the right thing by acting in their own self-interest.
Well, I think more than in theory, right? Because I think a lot of the other systems are more in theory. Like communism is more the idea of the community. Socialism is more idea of social policy. Capitalism takes none of that into theory. It's all about what people want. Like you're interested in helping yourself. Well, capitalism is the system that encourages you and is you look out for yourself, you do the best for yourself, but somehow in the process of doing that, you actually do what's best for society. Because ultimately, let's say you produce a piece of crap, I don't know, technology or garbage.
Right.
Eventually, you'll be removed. No
Right.
one will buy it, and that's it.
So the theory is an established business or company starts doing something bad for society, then there's going to be competition, right? By someone offering a rival service, doing it better serving customers and stuff like that. And then that would force the entrenched company to do the right thing, right? So that would be like competition in action, motivating everyone to do the right thing.
You see this, right? In true unfettered capitalism, there's no like restrictions on things. So, for example, let's say you sell insulin right now for $20. If you don't have a lot of government control over that, then someone else says, "Well, excuse me, insulin doesn't cost that much to make," and then they produce a cheaper product, and that is beneficial to everyone.
Right.
And so it's really you're doing it because you want money, and that your competitor is a joke.
Right.
But really, what you've done is you've benefited society greatly because everyone gets insulin cheaper, which is something everyone needs. Right. And by relying on your own greed, you've actually helped people. So it's actually a win-win because you get to, a lot of people are like, oh, I can't, no one can see me in public, no one can see the horrible things. But with capitalism, you can do both.
So it's very interesting that you bring up insulin. It's a very interesting example because in America, which is a very capitalistic society, insulin is actually really expensive. It's like $300 to $400. Whereas Canada, with universal healthcare, is a much more socialist country, right? Although still capitalistic, but much more socialist. And their insulin is like less than $100. So in a sense, if capitalism works the way you say, then the U.S. should have much cheaper insulin prices than anywhere else.
It's true, but where are those controlled by? What is the insulin controlled by? What is that whole industry controlled by?
Well, it's the pharmaceutical companies.
It's largely controlled by whoever's lobbying the hardest because you can't necessarily just give people insulin on the street. Mm-hmm. You have to go through a whole system that's whole privatized to engineer to work against you, and that's approved by government legislation. For example, if all the government did was say, hey, this is actually... I understand that there's some need for independent verification. Like, okay, is this actually insulin? You're not putting fentanyl in my freaking insulin. Right. Verify it's insulin, but then why can't you just sell that?
Oh, do you need government regulation though? Because let's say you do sell insulin that's laced by fentanyl, then customers are gonna boycott the product, right? And so a competitor that's serving actual insulin is gonna get the business, right?
Well, it sounds like you're only proving my case then that having a more unfettered capitalism will only produce a better society eventually.
In theory, because you're advocating for unfettered capitalism, then we shouldn't even need government regulation for insulin, right?
Maybe. Process. Maybe that's one of the things, right? If you take your philosophy, of course, I think completely unfettered capitalism. I'm sure there's some things we don't know about yet. But yeah, I think in general, you see like there are many benefits to lessening the government control of certain pipelines. For example, insulin. You could have a competitor that just comes up and produces a better quality product, and if it's not locked in the system already, then it can just happen, right? There's none of this like, granted, people always go to the cheaper markets, but ultimately, if people aren't buying your product, people aren't buying your product. And
Right.
it doesn't matter how rich you are, you're still controlled by that market.
Right.
Unless you have government subsidies that basically let you do whatever you want, ultimately you're still controlled by the market. People don't want your stuff, they're not going to buy it.
But I think insulin is so expensive is not necessarily because there's a lot of government regulation in the US. It's because these pharmaceutical companies, they have a monopoly on insulin, right? So they can jack up the prices however high they want. And because insulin, you literally need it to live, well, people are going to pay a lot of money for it because they have to.
But then I guess what's the issue with a small company coming up that creates insulin cheaper?
Right. Theoretically, that's what should happen,
preventing
right?
what's preventing that then? Do you think that's intercorporation bullying?
Probably. I mean, we see that with a lot of big corporations where they'll buy out like a smaller competitor, right, to get rid of their competition. In theory, the smaller competition is supposed to compete with the bigger ones, but we see in capitalism, like, typically what the pattern that you see is companies get bigger and bigger. They start to merge with other companies through acquisitions and mergers and stuff, so they get bigger so that they can eat everyone else. They just get bigger, and then it becomes smaller and smaller for small businesses to compete with them. So there's fewer and fewer competitors. I mean, the end game for capitalism is monopolies, essentially. At a certain point, it becomes very hard for smaller startups to compete with these entrenched businesses. So I think, like, in the end, early on in capitalism, maybe there's a lot of innovation and competition, and that's good. But later on, innovation and competition get stifled, and you're left at the mercy of these mega corporations who control everything.
So you're saying that, could this be avoided any other way? Is it not the same? I mean, I guess who ultimately is controlled? Like the government kind of is controlled to some extent from the voters. Some extent.
The US government, yeah.
But you could argue that also it's controlled by the rich as well. So you have kind of a unfettered capitalism where it's not necessarily anarchy, but it's kind of largely unregulated. Or you have a regulated one where technically they are still under control by the government.
Right.
Which one is more fair to the consumer?
I would say the government, right? Because the government, assuming it's voted by the people and stuff, theoretically the government should have the interest of the people at heart, right? The government has the real motivation to keep their people healthy. So the government should have oversight and regulation to these corporations because these corporations are not going to do anything except chase after profit, right? We've seen companies actually act against the interests of their consumers, like in the brake scandal with like some auto companies, right? Where they're like, okay, well the fines for releasing vehicles with defective brakes is actually less than the money that we will lose than selling these cars with broken brakes to customers. They've already done that calculus. They're not thinking about the benefit of the people they're selling the cars to. They're thinking about the bottom line, right? So who is going to care about the people who are actually driving these cars? It would be the government. You need government insights, oversight, and regulation on these companies to make sure that they actually do what's best for the consumer.
And why is it important that why would it be so important that we protect this kind of so we don't have intercoming bullying, right? Like, is it actually important that this happens? Can't we just learn over time? Like, won't the economy just kind of develop over time? For example, like I've heard some of those like Ford just did a cost benefit analysis and kind of just left it alone, people to die. But wouldn't that make people stop buying Fords and buy something else, and so eventually Ford would kind of disappear? And wouldn't that balance itself out naturally than compared to government intervention?
I mean,
Wouldn't companies be more afraid if there was no backup? So they can't get bailouts, they can't get anything. So they need constant profit. They can't do this because there is no recovery net.
yeah, I mean, in theory, a scandal like that would be enough to turn away customers from brand loyalty and stuff like that. Maybe there is some stigma, but I feel like people either don't know about it or they don't care enough, or there's not that many choices, right? Like, let's say you buy a Ford pickup truck, right? They're really well known for their pickup trucks. Could people just theoretically move off and buy a pickup truck from another company? I don't know if it's quite the same as driving like a Toyota pickup truck. I mean, Toyotas are known for their pickup trucks too, but like people are loyal to a brand for a reason, right? And I don't think it's that easy for people to just switch over as soon as something happens. And also, you've already done the damage to the customers from the broken brakes, right? Like that's human loss, life that has been lost that you can't get back. So damage has already been done too. So I mean, we have had multiple scandals to big companies over the years, right? Like Audi had their emissions scandal, right, where they were cheating the emission tests. Toyota has had like the airbag scandal, right, where they had the defective airbags with the callbacks. But I mean, these companies are still doing super fine, right? I mean, these companies are literally like too big to fail. So I mean, they'll just probably just come out, they'll apologize, they'll pay the fine, and then life moves on. So maybe it's the consumer's fault for not being, strict enough with these companies and making, because that's who they're listening to ultimately in the end. But also, for one consumer in a vacuum, like they're not thinking about like, oh, my buying choices is going to dictate this company's future policy. They're thinking, I only have so much money, and I need this car to live, to drive to my work or whatever. I need to make the best decision kind of economically for me. I can actually make a moral decision with my wallet.
So it's almost like capitalism on its unfettered self is actually dangerous and largely responsible. Its unfetteredness is largely responsible for a lot of the bad issues we have today.
Well, I suppose depends on where you draw the line.
But isn't that always how? Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, and let us know what we should talk about next.